With the onset of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, a lot of people have been re-examining our monetary system. There was a lot of criticism of the Federal Reserve's role in particular. A lot of people feel that the Federal Reserve printed too much fiat money and they have too much discretion over the monetary system. They prefer a return to something like the gold standard of the 19th century. At the same time, most economists, including myself, are somewhat skeptical of the gold standard for reasons having to do with the Great Depression. So Larry, why has gold gotten a bad rap?
It's gotten a bad rap because people think the Great Depression was the result of the gold standard, whereas in fact it's the result of central bank mismanagement of a system that was partly gold standard, partly central bank discretion in the interwar period. If you go back to the classical gold standard, before there were central banks in the US and Canada and other countries, or the central banks that existed were more playing by the rules of the game, you don't have an event like the Great Depression. The classical gold standard was characterized by periods of mild inflation followed by periods of mild deflation and really a pretty steady price level over the long horizons.
Let's take that example. So I agree there was government meddling during that period, but fundamentally the problem in the Great Depression was a big global increase in the demand for gold. Why is that bad? Because under gold standard, the nominal price of gold is fixed. So when there's more demand for gold, its real value can only rise by the price of everything else falling. And when you have a lot of deflation, you tend to get high unemployment. Even if that was a mishandled gold standard, the thing I worry about is if we return to the gold standard, there could be some global shock that creates a big increase in demand for gold, such as a boom in Asia, and that could be deflationary for the world economy.
Well, as you know, the big increase in the demand for gold during the Great Depression came from central banks. It didn't come from the private economy. And if we go to the historical record and ask how big were demand shocks for gold under the classical gold standard, they weren't that big. The biggest example I know of was Germany decides to join the gold standard, so they're buying a lot of gold in order to make gold coins. And it has a very minor effect. One that's easily accommodated, doesn't cause any Great Depression.
Just as there was sort of a good and bad period for the gold standard, you could say under fiat money there was kind of a bad period that was the 60s through the early 80s with really high inflation. But then central banks switched to targeting inflation, and basically inflation's been pretty close to 2% in recent years. So much of the pressure to return to the gold standard is to prevent this really high inflation. It's an anchor for the price level. But couldn't you say that we've sort of solved the problem of high inflation with our more recent fiat money system, and that takes the pressure off returning to the gold standard?
So the case for a gold standard is not just that the average inflation rate would be lower, it's also that the price level would be more predictable, right? Because there's commitment and because there's a equilibrating mechanism in the gold mining industry to bring the price level back to a predictable path, you find errors in predicting the future price level, this is kind of a subtle point, were smaller under the gold standard. You could rely on where the price level was going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now, whereas today there's a huge amount of drift.
Admitted.
So if you look at financial markets, you found 50-year bonds being issued under the gold standard. You found 100-year bonds being issued. The British government refinanced its debt with perpetual bonds. There is no market for 100-year bonds, perpetual bonds nowadays, because nobody knows what the dollar is going to be worth when it's paid back 50 years from now. So having that kind of a credible anchor makes the financial system deeper. And it's hard to quantify how big a benefit that is, but it means more long-term planning, more long-term investment by lowering the cost of making those kind of commitments with nominal contracts.
I guess in the end, I feel that even a well-run gold standard, which I think did a good job for people in the 19th century overall, falls short of a well-run fiat money system. So I really think that the argument that I think...
Have we had a well-run fiat money system that you can point to?